Some of the moments when I was in the roughest times of my life, being able to not only survive, thrive, but also then, achieve and sort of build a world around me, that was insulated from some of the pain of growing up and insulated from some of those negative issues. The access that one gets to story and to camaraderie and community through offering new ideas has been very, very profoundly helpful, into my personal story. Hi, my name is Glenn Kaino, and this is How Art Changed Me. I grew up in a suburb of LA, in a small town called Cerritos. That was halfway between LA and Orange County. And at the time was a pasture cow farm town, but small town suburban neighborhood. I felt at a young age I was attracted to making art, particularly was making my own toys, and my family didn't necessarily come from means. We would have toys, but every time we would get a toy, let's say there would be a set or a vehicle or whatever, and we were not able to afford all of the vehicles, but we'd see people across the street who would have them, and so I would make my own vehicles and make our own sets, literally build the worlds for us to play with. And at some point, all the other kids wanted to come over and play with our sets because they were unique, and that was empowering in a way. I had a few young mentor, other elementary school, high school kids who were making stuff as well, and we would go to each other's houses and to learn about making work, whether it's stop motion animation films with small little cameras that our parents had, or toys out of paper towel tubes and whatnot. It was very sophisticated for what we were. But I think the first awareness I had of the idea that art was a business or a job was I saw an art magazine. It was a Damien Hirst cover of Flash Art magazine, and I was like, what is this amazing looking shark on the cover of an art magazine? How is this art? And I dug in, and it transformed my knowledge of that there was a landscape of art where people were artists, and not just kids making things in their backyard. And that was inspiring and exciting. And then I dug into the history of art and really kind of never left. I had a rough childhood, and I was kicked out of a bunch of high schools and into gang culture or whatnot. And I actually was able to leave and survive, through making art. Practically speaking, as an artist, in those worlds, I think that everyone is inspired by the idea of generation and creation. And so I was given a little bit of a pass, and that sort of practically created the opportunity, for me to get out of a zone of society that I grew up in, that was not as generative or generous. So art's always been there for me, and in any of these moments of crisis, just thinking about things, in new ways and inspiring people around me, has always been there to help me. For me, an artwork happens when there's something in the world that I'm interested in understanding that I don't quite understand. There's a story or a reference point, and somehow it catalyzes into an idea. And I say I use art and the opportunities that art has afforded me to put together people, places, things, and stories that don't normally have a chance to meet. But art services as a really great layer of abstraction that allows for collaboration and camaraderie of ideas, fellowship of ideas, because the expectations are just that it's imaginative. The only expectation on a good artwork is that everyone is imaginative together, and that we thought of something new that inspires people. My practice in studio, I'm driven by what I loosely call a constellation of concerns, larger thematic explorations that I have had throughout my entire career. For a long time, my Asian Americanness, my Japanese Americanness did not factor overtly into the work. Entering the cultural landscape when I did, sort of mid to late 90s, early aughts, I was advised by scholars, critics, curators to focus on what they would call bigger issues. What you internalize as an Asian American artist is that being Asian American is not a big issue. In the last 20 years, the world has changed in really incredible ways, in expansive and inclusive ways. Most recently, I have been doing a more deep, explicit exploration, of that part of my life and part of my story, and come to find out that, of course, encoded within the entire body of work throughout the years of my practice, there have been principles, both formal, conceptual, that have in fact deeply resonated with my cultural histories. And that's something that I think I've always known and has been embedded, but something that I'm very excited about embracing, particularly as it comes to the moment and times we're in, and the contradiction between the power of owning your own story, minding your own story, but the power of generosity and sharing stories. So more recently, I have been working in film and linear media. And so the object I brought with me today is a super high-end film camera called the PXL 2000. And it is actually made in 1981 by Fisher-Price. And it is a toy camera that you can record video and audio on audio cassettes. Many people these days have no idea what this is. This was an audio cassette. Again, we're in a moment where the quest for higher resolution, higher fidelity, and the quest to have digital media and fabricated media look like real life is a cultural priority. Real life is already real life, so us trying to figure out how to replicate real life without a point of view, that's where we get into crisis of people freaking out about AI or whatnot, because AI and digital media can absolutely accelerate the pathways towards recreating the known, because the known is a roadmap. And for something with lower resolution, for me, point of view has no roadmap. Point of view is a path that you have to discover. Creating something that is photorealistic on a camera that just gets better and better and better and looks more like real life is a pathway that we all can understand. So I'm really excited about working with this to create images that we don't understand, and images that, if we blur our eyes, can't tell are real or imagined. And I found also, when no one expects a result, sometimes you get the best results. There should be no expectation except for to imagine a better world. Through our dedication, through our insistence that art has relevance, we can then insist that the world is not yet figured out. Because there's a magic to seeing a good film, there's a magic of seeing a good artwork, to hearing a good song, that changes the way people understand the world in fundamental ways. And I think it's fundamentally important, that we support young artists and we support artists at large to be able to have safe spaces to go freely imagine, because only in those spaces will we actually figure out how the world works. There are people in the world who are imagining a world without art for us, and we are in a moment where people are trying to create a world without art. Because a world without art is a world without point of view, and a world without point of view is a world that's just subservient and in service to the norm. We're sitting in a moment where, for many of us, our stories and our backstories are the last things that we think we can own and possess and be proud of, because everything else is being stripped away and taken away. And I do think that there's a moment of generosity that needs to happen within cross-cultural storytelling. Let's not use the power of our imagination to imagine a world without art. There are jackasses already trying to do that for us.